Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. My guest today is Fernanda Pirie, and the author of the new book, The Rule of Laws, a 4,000-Year Quest to Order the World. Fernanda Pirie is a professor of the Anthropology of Law at the University of Oxford. She's the author of the Anthropology of Law textbook and has conducted fieldwork in the mountains of Ladakh and the grasslands of eastern Tibet. She earned her doctorate of philosophy and social anthropology from Oxford in 2002, master's in social anthropology at the University College London in 1998, and a BA in French and philosophy from Oxford in 1986. She spent almost a decade practicing as a barrister at the London Bar, and she lives in Oxford. So this was quite the interesting conversation, as is her book, in terms of thinking about issues of law and order, which have been in the news rather a lot lately, people taking the law into their own hands, vigilantism and self-help justice and so on. And so I asked her a lot about that, and starting with the question, why do we need laws at all? Can't we all just get along? Apparently not. Definitely not. And so we go back in time to the first kings of ancient Mesopotamia and the laws that they wrote down, to what extent laws were involved with religion. That is, most of the biblical laws and Sharia law and so on were very much wrapped up in secular governments and their laws. Chinese emperors and Tibetan communities that she lived among, and how they solved conflicts. Conflict resolution is a huge part of legal systems. Talked about slavery and how it was ultimately abolished. Colonialism and what people were thinking when they were doing that. That is, migrating Western laws into non-Western countries. Talked a lot about stateless laws, that is, tribes and villages and networks and gangs like the Godfather and the Mafia. Pirate laws, to what extent pirates were actually not psychopathic, lawless anarchists, that they had their own constitutions. Talked about international law, crimes against humanity, the outlawry of law, that is, of war, that is, war is outlawed, and the quest for cosmic justice, why we always have this deep sense in our human nature of wanting justice and fairness. And then I put the question to her that I put to Elon Musk online, which is, what form of government and law should we have set up on Mars? And I read her Elon's response, and then she offered me hers, which was very enlightening. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for supporting the podcast. If you do, as always, you can go to skeptic.com/donate and make a donation to our 501c3 nonprofit, which is tax deductible, and it supports this podcast as well as our other efforts. So thank you for listening. Today's episode is brought to you by Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com, Wondrium, which is the former teaching company, The Great Courses, who I've produced a couple of courses for, longtime listener, been a fan since the 1990s when I've been taking these courses via cassette tape, audio tape, and a Sony Walkman. Okay, that's how far back I go. At any rate, here's the great thing about the Great Courses and now Wondrium is that you can access all their content online through a subscription service. So instead of purchasing a course or renting a course, and then you sort of feel like you have to listen to all of them, if you don't like a lecture, skip to the next one. If you don't like a course, skip to the next course, or any course like that. So, for example, you just open one up, like this one I just opened up, Norse mythology. Think you know about Norse mythology from comic books, operas, film, and television? Well, I don't know, but anyway, uncover startling truths about old Norse myths, sagas, gods, heroes, and monsters. 24 lectures, 30 minutes each, which I do at usually around 1.2 speed, so you can get through them in about 20 minutes, which is perfect for a drive or running some errands or doing chores around the house, hiking, walking, whatever you're doing. For fun, here's just a few examples of some of the lectures, which you can listen to on audio only, or you can flip over the switch to video. And the content is great because it has lots of really cool graphics and illustrations, paintings, portraits, pictures, and so forth that accompany the lectures. Meeting the Norse gods of the Viking Age, fate and the Norse worldview, the Norse gods are characters with flaws, the Norse creation, Loki and his children, Baldur's death. Oh boy, these are going to be great. Odin, the Lord of War and the Dead. Dwarves, elves, trolls, and zombies. Ooh, that sounds cool. Norse magic, Norse religion, the afterlife. I mean, you can see why I'd be interested in this topic, of which I know next to nothing, even though I've read quite a bit on these general topics of mythology and religion. There's always more to learn, which is the great thing about Wondrium. It's a never-ending autodidactic process of you're always teaching yourself. So here's the deal. If you sign up through our podcast, you get a free 1-month subscription, and then you can cancel or you can continue. Why would you cancel? It's such a great product. So go to wondrium.com/Shermer. That's wondrium.com/Shermer, Shermer. You get a 1-month free trial. Then you can cancel at any time after that, or you can continue, which I recommend. Any case, that's how the podcast is supported, that and through our skeptic.com. And so if you appreciate the podcast, you should really give this service a try. It's really fantastic. All right, thanks for listening, and here's our episode. Fernanda, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for talking to me, and thanks for your book. I read this massive beast of a book. Look how thick this thing is. I did the audio edition, which was quite entertaining. So, but before we get into that, you are a professor of the Anthropology of Law at the University of Oxford. What is the Anthropology of Law? Do you study what lawyers do behind closed doors and that the rest of us don't know about?
Interestingly, I might be going to study what lawyers do, but up till now, it's not what I've been doing. I've been really studying how other people use law, resolve conflict, don't use law in other parts of the world. So it's law in unfamiliar environments.
Right. Give us a little bit of background of how you got into that. Where did you grow up and go to school, and how'd you get interested in all these topics?
Oh, well, I had a very sort of a fairly standard Southern England upbringing in Winchester, a nice market town. Father was a school teacher. He was a great gardener and sort of always made us interested in the countryside and that sort of thing. And I followed a fairly standard academic career. I studied philosophy of my undergrad, and then I decided to become a barrister. So I actually practiced law for 10 years in London. And then I went on a really inspiring trip to Tibet. And I was looking at all these Tibetans living these amazing lives, and suddenly thought I would really like to spend a lot of time here and really get to understand these people and how they live their lives. And came back and announced, I want to change a career. I want to be an explorer. To which everybody said, well, what do you actually think you're going to do? Anyway, that idea led to anthropology. It took me back to Oxford. I did a doctorate in anthropology. I went to Tibet. I lived there for a year and was lucky enough then to get a job as an anthropologist of law. I was interested in how the Tibetans resolved their disputes. That's my sort of legal background then coming in with my anthropological interest. And that's where it all started.
Interesting. Right. Well, we can come back to that in your chapter on tribes and other stateless organizations and how they create laws. But first, why do we need laws in the first place? Let's just give a kind of a big picture thing, like to quote Rodney King, why can't we all just get along?
That assumes we need laws to resolve our disputes. And the fact is there are plenty of societies that do perfectly well with no law. So it's one of the questions I'm sort of addressing in the book. Who makes law and why? Because not all sophisticated societies have made law, and the ancient Egyptians did perfectly well without it. The Maya and the Aztec in Southern America, as far as we can tell, had no laws. Plenty of much smaller communities and groups done perfectly well without any laws. So using law to address disputes is a bit particular. It's a particular social form. So I don't think we can all just get along. I do think it's inevitable that people are going to come into conflict. But there are lots of different ways of resolving it, and law is just one of them.
Right. So here's how I think of the argument here. I'm taking these numbers from Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he talks about the studies of these small bands of Papua New Guineans that he lived with. And he says, like, a small band of 20 people generates 190 possible dyads, or two-person interactions, 20 times 19 divided by 2, small enough for informal conflict resolution. But increase that 20 to 2,000 and you're facing 1,999,000 possible dyads, 2,000 times 1999 divided by 2. So here, a 100-fold population increase produces a 10,000-fold dyadic rise. So you scale that up to cities of 200,000 or 2 million, and the potential for conflict multiplies beyond comprehension, along with the laws and regulations needed to ensure relative harmony and efficiency. And here's how Jared describes it in Guns, Germs, and Steel. Quote, once the threshold of several hundred, below which everyone can know everyone else, has been crossed, increasing numbers of dyads become pairs of unrelated strangers. Hence, a large society that continues to leave conflict resolution to all of its members is guaranteed to blow up. That factor alone would explain why societies of thousands can exist only if they develop centralized authority to monopolize force and resolve conflict. But I gather from reading your book that's not always the case.
I don't think it is, no. And there are some other authors at the moment, like James Scott, David Graeber, and David Wengrove just published that big book on very early civilizations, who question that sort of
I have
analysis.
it right here.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's on my desk waiting to be read. And there certainly have been pretty sophisticated societies that have been relatively decentralized, where there have been local forms of organization sort of joined together through systems of taxation, trade, tribute, religion maybe, without necessarily centralized authority. And so I suppose the question is, well, the number of questions. One, why and when do societies develop a sort of centralized authority, with all the problems then of hierarchy that often brings with it? And when do they use laws to try and manage the problems that then brings about? I would say those two things are fairly well correlated. The need for law once society gets centralized and a hierarchy develops, although the fit isn't perfect.
So do you think of it that hierarchy develops for some other reason, and then the law follows to deal with that particular structure, as opposed to the laws had to be written down and somebody had to enforce them, and that's the hierarchy?
I wouldn't want to say there's always one direction of travel. In ancient India, for example, a hierarchy gradually developed over several thousand years in the first millennium before the Common Era, at the head of which there were the priests, eventually the Brahmins, and the kings. And that gradually developed into the caste system we know today. But the laws came along some way through that process. The legal text by which the Brahmins started writing down the rules which everyone should obey, including the kings.
Right. So, and the idea of writing them down or chiseling them in stone, literally, is that it's something you can point to, not just, hey, don't you remember I said 6 months ago you shouldn't do that? It's like, this is formalized and everybody has a copy. We all know what it is. And therefore you can hold people morally culpable for their actions.
Exactly. You put your finger right on it. And so that's a distinction I'm pointing to in several places in this book, that's what makes a difference. Every societies have customs, they have norms, they often have elders they look to as sources of authority, experts on tradition. But as you say, when it's just a matter of, oh yes, this is what we've always done. Don't you remember this happened? People can forget conveniently or otherwise, but once something is written down, then it has an authority. You can look at what the exact words are. And it means there are different possibilities for exercising power. Look, these are the laws. Everyone must know. They've got to follow them. But equally, different possibilities for holding people to account.
Yeah, you use this word casuistry in the if-then format. If you break the law, then these are the consequences. Almost like a logic puzzle. If P then Q, P then Q. And so there's a kind of internal logic behind it of how we reason causally. A follows, B follows A, so we assume A causes B. Something like that, cognitively.
Well, that casuistic form is a feature of a lot of law, but not really all of it. It's very prominent in the Mesopotamian tradition, which gave rise to both Jewish and Islamic laws, and ultimately the Roman laws and the ones which now dominate the world. And it's associated with a specification of rights. These are if somebody does this, they're entitled to that sort of compensation, or this must follow from it. Absolutely, that sort of cause and effect. But the laws that developed in China and India were rather different. I mean, the Chinese had a much more sort of top-down penal system, discipline and punishment. It was a different type of if-then. Everything was about, if you get this wrong, you shall be punished. Very centralized, very controlling. Whereas the laws that developed in Hindu India were much more about individual duty. This is what you ought to do. To be a good Hindu, you should do this. You should, if you're a king, you should resolve disputes in this way. So the distinction between those three things aren't very sharp. But the casuistic form that you've just described, I think, is a particular feature of a certain type of legal system.
Yeah, I like this passage from your introduction. Laws have never simply been rules. They have created intricate maps for civilization. Far from purely concrete or mundane, throughout their history, laws have presented a social vision, promised justice, invoked the moral order ordained by God, and enshrined the principles of democracy and human rights. And while laws have surely been an instrument of power, they have just as often been the means of resisting it. Yet the rule of law is neither universal nor inevitable. Some rulers have avoided submitting themselves to the constraints of law. Really? Such as the Chinese emperors did for 2,000 years, and a recent American politician has kind of pushed that envelope too.
Tried to do.
The rule tried to do that. Yes, the rule of law has a history, and we need to understand that history. We appreciate what law is, what it does, and how it can rule our world for better as well as for worse. Which is why I really love this book. So here I thought of Thomas Sowell's book, the Quest for Cosmic Vision or Cosmic Justice. That there's this sense that it's not just norms and mores that we're following. There's something deeper about it. We want ultimate justice, that everything is settled in the end. And even modern Christians think like that one of the purposes of an afterlife is that all scores are settled. God is going to judge everything. So even if you think you got away with it, you didn't get away with it, because there's an eye in the sky that knows all this stuff, and that adds an element of, I don't know, divine order to the legal systems.
Absolutely, and that characterizes a lot of the big legal systems. I mean, obviously the ones that we would associate with religion. So the Hindu legal system, where there's very much a sense of cosmological order behind the whole thing. The Dharma, that everybody must follow their own Dharma, and what the Brahmins are doing is setting up the rules to help people follow the Dharma, and then they'll get a better rebirth. And the Islamic legal system as well, which has got such a bad press in the world at the moment, but has so much to be understood and admired historically. Again, the idea of law as an aspect of the Sharia, following God's path for the world, a sense of the way the world ought to be and the way humans ought to behave in accordance with this divine plan. And even the Chinese, which I just described as historically a very top-down and punitive system. Of course, the emperors claimed they had the mandate of heaven. That's why everyone had to obey them, obey their laws. That's why they were at the top of the pyramid. But there have been laws through the ages, which I would describe in much more pragmatic terms, the things that merchants do to hold their networks together, village rules and regulations. So I wouldn't say that sort of cosmic vision is an aspect of everything we'd call law. Law is a much more flexible, adaptable technique than that. But yes, absolutely, it characterizes so many of the sort of big and really impressive and long-lasting legal systems.
Yeah, I mean, I often think of the Arab-Israeli conflict problem is you have two guys with a deed to the same piece of land, and each of them says, the title company that guarantees my ownership of this land is God or the Holy Book. And unfortunately, God wrote more than one Holy Book, and so there's no world court or cosmic court to take it to.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. But I mean, that's been the case throughout history, really. There have been these overlapping legal and political jurisdictions. And a lot of people get extremely worried at the moment about the problems of whether the nation state, as we know it, the nation state into which pretty well all parts of the world are now divided, whether that's breaking down because of supranational laws, the growth of transnational law, and so on. But it's always been like that. There have always been overlaps between religious laws, and the Middle East is a perfect example of a place where there have always been religious communities of different faiths sort of rubbing shoulders with each other. It's never necessarily been easy, um, but people have developed over the ages ways of sort of living together. I think it's a particular problem of our age that particular political battles are being fought out at the moment in the Middle East.
Yeah, you have this great example from Hammurabi. These are the judicial decisions that Hammurabi the king has established to bring about truth and a just order in his land. This is his text that you're quoting here. Let any wrong man who has a lawsuit, interesting that word, whatever the original word actually was, is one we still use today, who has a lawsuit come before my image as king of justice and have what is written on my stele read to him, so that he may understand my precious commands, and let my stele demonstrate his position, so that he may understand his case and calm his heart. I am Hammurabi, king of justice, to whom Shamash has granted the truth. And then you quote like a specific example here. If a man cuts down a tree in another man's date orchard without his permission, he shall pay 30 shekels of silver. If a man has given a field to a gardener to plant as a date orchard, when the gardener has planted it, he shall cultivate it for 4 years, and in the 5th year the owner and gardener shall divide the yield in equal shares, and the owner shall choose his share first. I mean, so that down to the specifics, it sounds like a business contract.
Indeed, they're trying to ensure fairness among the farmers who were sort of the backbone of the wealth of Babylon at the time. And I like the fact that there's another set of rules that deals with compensation for doctors kill or injure their patients. It's very easy to think of medical negligence being a particular problem in the modern world. It's been around for 4,000 years.
Yeah. So, but how did they determine like what's the value of a stray cattle or or you cut down the wrong tree and it's 30 shekels? Where do they get these numbers? It must be a
really
history of negotiation on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's a really interesting question because, of course, these laws were meant to last. And even in a relatively stable society, the value of money would have changed. So people have looked at this and said, well, how can people have followed these laws? Certainly for the hundreds of years through which that stele was standing and people were still referring to it and copying out the laws. I mean, they did that for about a millennium. And so surely the laws are out of date. My own view is that these are more exemplary. They probably reflected actual cases, the sorts of decisions that judges were making at the time Hammurabi wrote his rules. So he didn't expect people to apply them exactly. They weren't like our rules that the judges have to follow in detail. They more gave an indication of the sorts of compensation that should be given for different sorts of wrongs or crimes, the sorts of things that were worse that might merit the death penalty, the sorts of torts, as we call them now, that were less grave. I think he must have been collecting together a lot of judicial systems and sort of crafting them into a set of general laws, but they still had the flavour of individual decisions.
Is there a sense of, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing, like a equitable system where the punishment should fit the law, more or less? Punishment should fit the crime, more or less.
Absolutely, and I think that's what he was really trying to establish by writing out the rules. Look, this is how we can ensure that justice is done. This is the right sort of response to this sort of wrong, the right sort of compensation for this sort of problem. But it's really important that that famous phrase, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which comes in the laws of Exodus, it was there originally in Hammurabi. There must be a connection, even though there's a whole 1,000 years between them. People think, I think plausibly, that it was a rule of limitation. It wasn't telling people they had to go out and take an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth or a life for a life. It was saying, if you take revenge, as was probably happening all the time, because it's a very basic way of addressing conflict. If you go and take revenge, that's all you should do. So you shouldn't escalate a feud, because that's an age-old problem in this feuding society. Someone goes and steals a sheep, and then someone comes back and steals a cow, and then someone tries to take a whole herd of sheep, and the whole thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So it was a sort of pragmatic rule in a society where feuding relations were common, was just trying to keep a lid on things. So absolutely, as you said, justice is only an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth.
Yes, from the ruler's perspective, a feud is a net loss, regardless of who's right or wrong. So you have to stop it as quickly as possible.
And you see that all over the world. Sorry.
No, go ahead. All over the world. Yeah.
I was saying you see that all over the world. So, I mean, feuding is just a very common way of addressing disputes, particularly among nomadic people. And the idea, which sounds very plausible to me, is that if you're nomadic pastoralist, your wealth is mobile. You can take it around you because it's animals, so it's easy to steal. If you're a farmer, your wealth is your land, and you can't carry off a bit of land. So nomads are particularly vulnerable. So in a way, having a feuding system is a sort of defense mechanism. It's like saying to the world, if you come and steal my sheep, I'll come and steal your cow. So anyway, we find it all over the world, still in parts of eastern Tibet, where I've recently done field work. But just as you said, the kings who come along, the centralized rulers, they want to stop it. It's a net loss. They want to try and put a lid on it and establish a more centralized system of justice. So that's exactly what Hammurabi was doing. You find that in early Anglo-Saxon England, all over the world.
Interesting. Yeah, I just had Richard Nisbet on my show. He's the social psychologist that studies cultures of honor. He's the guy that did the famous research of Southern United States students from Southern states versus Northern states in an experimental apparatus. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but the setup is students have to fill out a little form and then walk it down the hallway and turn it into some office or something. That's just a setup. And along the way on the hallway, there's some guy fiddling around with papers or whatever. And when the subject walks by, he kind of bumps him and says, "Asshole." And then you see what the response is, right? And so the students from northern states famously kind of apologized. "Oh, I'm so sorry." And, they were very kind about it. The students from southern states, on the other hand, were like, "Oh, yeah, you want to take this outside?" And then he drew their blood and it showed that the southern state students had high testosterone levels and stress hormones were pumping, and they were ready to just kind of mix it up. So his theory was that the southern states were populated more by herders and ranchers, and so they had to cultivate this culture of honor where there is no state. We're beyond the long arm of the law, so we have to settle things ourselves. Whereas northern states, particularly the New England states, democracy came early, and most of the citizens were de-armed, and except for that Second Amendment thing. But most of them didn't settle their scores that way, and they had more of a culture of whatever you want to call it, law and order, something like that.
There may be something in that. I'm not an expert on the recent history of the US, so I don't want to particularly weigh in on that debate. But there is certainly a sort of culture in societies which are not used to centralized states coming and organizing and laying down rules and regulating everything. And as you say, it's about honor. There's almost an obligation to get angry, to take revenge. And that's exactly what I was looking at among the nomads of eastern Tibet when I did fieldwork there about a decade ago, nomadic pastoralists. And you could see this happening. Somebody was somebody's sheep was stolen. It happened in the family in the tent I was living with, and the eldest man in the family was sort of working himself up into a sort of a sense of anger and determination to take revenge. And as somebody else explained to me, you have to get angry in that circumstances. So it's almost like the young men are encouraged. There's a sort of culture of honor, revenge, retaliation. So it's very much a societal thing. So it's entirely plausible that certain societies in even the US have got the sort of remnants of this still, in the way that their young people behave.
Yeah, Steve Pinker talks about the problem is that we're not moral enough. It's that we're too moral. There's too much moralizing that goes on where people get just worked up over anything and everything, as we see on cancel culture on social media. But then, in fact, he cites Donald Black's research, a sociologist of crime, of what he calls self-help justice. That is, something like 90% of homicides are moralistic in nature, not instrumental where you rob the liquor store and you accidentally shot the clerk because you were trying to get the money, but that somebody insulted you or slept with your girlfriend or cheated in pool or took your parking spot. And when you're in a culture like we are in America, where everyone has guns, the guns are just everywhere, that escalates quickly to a homicide. But it's moralistic in nature.
Sure. I mean, that relates to another interesting point, that I mean, every society has something to say about homicide. It's as if it's so important that they have to have some sort of lay out what the response should be. But I don't think we should imagine that they're trying to stop people doing it, because the fact is that we don't not kill people because the law tells us we shouldn't do it. We don't do it because we think it's wrong to do it. Save in those few circumstances where somehow the morality has got twisted because of whatever it is, and so people do cross that line. So what the law is doing in that case is really just saying, well, a terrible thing has happened. So what should the social response be? Should there be compensation? Should there be punishment? By what? In what nature? And so on.
The family you stayed with when the sheep was stolen, what happened?
Oh, well, so the young man was sitting there around the fire drinking his tea, in preparation for going off and taking revenge, and he was going to round up his friends. And his mother was sitting there saying, whoa, 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 calm down, calm down. She was a real matriarch, a wonderful woman. And his wife was sort of chipping in, you sure you want to do this? And meanwhile, somebody was sent to get the local headman who was going to come along and sort of try and calm everything down. And so, at the same time, I think people expected that was what was going to happen. And so eventually the headman went off with some of the other sort of elder men of that encampment to track down the perpetrators and negotiate a form of compensation. So that is what all normally happens in these circumstances. That's normally how these types of feuds are actually prevented. And it's what a lot of the laws are trying to do as well, is try and set out levels of compensation so that revenge doesn't have to be taken.
Right. And my deeper point on that is that we have probably in our human nature, the impulse to want justice and fairness. And when it doesn't happen, and if the state fails to do it through the legal methods, people take the law into their own hands. I mean, we're recording this on the last week of October or November here when, two big trials in America were settled with verdicts in which Kyle Rittenhouse was a young man, 17 years old, who went to this protest. This was a kind of another one of these police shootings of a black man in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And he went there because he didn't think the police were going to protect the property of the whoever he thought the protesters were going to do to mix it up there and destroy a property. So, but unfortunately, he took a gun, and the other guys had guns, and one of them had a skateboard that was beating him on the head with it, so on. And then next thing you know, 2 people are dead, and he was acquitted as self-defense, which I thought was the right decision. But as I told my wife, if our son was 17 and he said, "I'm going down to this protest where there's people are going to mix it up, and I'm taking a gun," I'd lock him in his room. I mean, that's insane.
Exactly. Exactly. Just asking for
but
trouble,
the same thing
isn't
happened.
it?
Asking for trouble in the Georgia case, again, in the South, Georgia has this law where you can have a citizen's arrest. Citizens can essentially take the law into their own hands, which they apparently occasionally do when they don't think the police are going to do anything about it. And then, again, guns come out, and then it's a bad idea. But the larger point, from back to your book, is that this is one of the reasons we need laws, and they need to be enforced regularly, fairly, justly, and consistently, so that people don't have that impulse to do it on their own.
Exactly. I mean, I'd put it a little bit more broadly than that. I think there needs to be systems of justice. So there can be systems of mediation. So, I mean, the other part of Tibet where I did field work was a village in Ladakh, which is part of northern India, but Tibetan populations there. They didn't have any written laws, but they had very good methods of getting together and resolving conflict. They put a lot of moral pressure on the parties to calm down, to shake hands. It's all about conciliation. Vastly different from the nomads that I did fieldwork with later in eastern Tibet. Just a whole different attitude, but extremely effective. And there was just a sort of moral sense that people shouldn't fight. They shouldn't even get angry with each other. So there was a process of settling things. Now, some people would look at that and say, but it's not justice. Because even really serious things, injuries and even a killing in one case is sort of sorted out like that. Even a rape in a village that someone else I know was doing fieldwork in. And it's easy to look at that and say, it's not justice. But for those villagers, maintaining peace and order in the community, being able to live together and get on was absolutely paramount. It worked for them. So every society needs some sort of system of restoring order and some sort of sense of justice. And the senses of justice vary very much. Is it revenge, or is it about restoring order? So the law can be part of that. So the sorts of justice which depend on applying laws. To come back to your original point about complex societies, there it's much more difficult to implement those more sort of bottom-up systems of mediation or conciliation. That's where it's very useful to have judges and laws and for justice to be found in those written texts. But it's also
How
why...
does it work?
Sorry.
How does it work where you were at? I mean, since there's no laws or courts, did they just agree tomorrow we're going to meet at noon and we're going to all sit down and talk this out?
Essentially, yeah. It was the headman's duty to call a village meeting, and it's the duty of everyone to go along then and help to resolve it. Absolutely, which you could do in a very small community like that.
And if you don't show up, there's social pressure to make you feel guilty, and
absolutely, yeah. Huge amounts of social pressure of people to play their part in village politics and contribute to village funds and village activities.
And if they don't, they're gossiped about or shunned or shamed, and
yes, all of it in all of those things in various ways.
Let's talk about religious laws. Yeah, you mentioned Sharia. Of course, from Western perspective, this just sounds like a disaster because it's been hyped up and associated with terrorist attacks. But in your book, you have a much longer, deeper discussion about its origin and purpose. And let's just kind of use that as an example. How does religious laws differ from sort of secular laws?
I'm just wondering how much one can generalize here. So the religious laws I'm thinking of, the laws of Hindu India, the Islamic laws, the Jewish laws, and I suppose the canon law in Europe, the Christian law. Um, so I'm hesitating a bit. I'm wondering how much I can generalize.
Well, let
I
me ask
think
a specific question while you're thinking about that. So, something like what drives modern minds crazy is like these specific laws in Leviticus about what food you can eat, what clothes you can wear, and even adultery. I mean, adultery. I mean, isn't that the that's the concern of the affected spouses? Why does the state care about who sleeps with who? And to modern ears, it's like, what were they thinking?
exactly. So that's one very important feature of Jewish, Jewish, Hindu, and Islamic laws, that the legal and the moral are really part of one domain. So a lot of the laws are really directed at guiding people as individuals on how to lead good moral lives in accordance with Dharma or God's path for the world or God's commands. So the sort of distinction we feel we need to draw, that a lot of legal scholars feel they need to draw between law and religion, law and morality, just doesn't make sense in most of those contexts. So the laws are about telling people how to live properly. And that can involve things like family relations, contracts, torts, land ownership. But it can also involve prayer, ritual, and so on. And the laws of Leviticus are just, they've been a puzzle for such a long time. But they're clearly about a sort of sense of purity and how the Jews should live as good people following these rules of cleanliness, partly which is what distinguished them from all the other tribes that surrounded them.
Right. You said something about the animals that chew the cud, so they're impure, or they were the pure. No, impure, right?
Those are okay.
Oh, those are okay. It's the other ones. Oh,
Those
the
are
pigs
okay.
are not
Yes,
okay. Yes. Right.
yes. I mean, these fantastically complicated rules, but these are the animals you can eat. If they chew the cud and they've got cloven hooves, you can eat them. These are the ones you can't. Obviously, pigs, but all sorts of other ones as well. Um, And people are puzzled over this for such a long time. Why should these be pure or impure? And you can't really explain it on the basis of sorts of food that are likely to make you ill. I mean, it just doesn't make enough sense to say that. And so it was an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, who sort of explained it to my eyes the most clearly. And she said that it was just about creating a sense of purity almost for its own sake, um, so that there had to be things which distinguish the Jews as proper followers of God from the Gentiles. And it wasn't just about what foods they ate, but it was also um, about keeping warriors' camps had to be kept apart from the business of war, because the business of war was dirty and unclean and polluting, and so that couldn't be allowed to sort of contaminate proper domestic life. Um, and priests had to be whole in their bodies; they couldn't be disfigured. And then there's all those bizarre rules about, well, you shouldn't weave together two different materials, wool and linen. You can't weave them together. You can't mix together different foods. And again, it's all this about creating a sense of purity. This is okay. This is pure. That's impure.
I wonder if it's something of also a social signaling or what we might call virtue signaling. If I see you going through all these steps, I know that I can count on you. You are a consistent group member, pure, reliable, trustworthy, and therefore I can give you my trust, and vice versa. If you see me going through the rituals every week.
That's a very good way of putting it. Yes, you're signaling that you're taking your religion seriously. You're a good member of the group. Exactly, that you can be counted upon as one of us.
Yeah. Okay. What is Sharia law?
Ah, Sharia law. Well, that's such a complicated question.
Yeah, I
Sharia
know.
is carries the sense of God's path for the world. So it's not itself best translated as law. And it's really a sense of a path that God has laid out for us that we can't fully understand, but we have to do our best to work out what he wanted. So the Quran obviously is a great help in that regard, but it doesn't exactly lay out in detail what everyone ought to do in order to follow God's path of the world. So what the early Islamic scholars were doing, they were important from the earliest days, was to use their learning and their scholarship and study the Quran, look back at the Hadith and the records of the Prophet's life, to try and work out in more detail how good Muslims should live in accordance with God's command, the path for the world. And so they developed the fiqh texts. These are the sort of what we call the legal texts with the more specific laws. So that's really Islamic law in those texts. And they go into a lot of detail about things like land ownership and commercial activities and legal disputes and inheritance and charitable trusts. In fact, Islamic law has very, very little to say about crime. And that's one of the things that people tend to think. Oh, there's terrible punishments, and there are some mentioned in the Quran, very few, because largely that was the business of the caliphs, the rulers. They were supposed to keep law and order, to work out what the best way was to punish crimes. So really, Islamic law and the Sharia was much more concerned with ritual and morality, inheritance, charitable trusts, and the other, as we might put it, more civil law matters.
How much of biblical, legal, and moral codes have changed over time? Here I'm thinking that, Christianity went through the Enlightenment and became much more liberal and tolerant and open, and eventually joined the civil rights movement in support and abolition of slavery and torture and women's rights, and now even gay rights. Even conservative Christians today, now 6 years after the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in the United States, hardly ever talk about it anymore. It's like, well, yeah, okay, God loves everybody, including gays. Okay. But, so the change is made. But the sense is that Islam didn't go through an enlightenment like that, where they become more liberalizing. That's probably an unfair characterization. Probably depends on which Muslim groups you're talking about and which countries or whatever. How do you think about that?
Yes, I would say that that's right. That and I have to say I've never thought exactly about that parallel. And there's always been a sense, and there's a sense in any legal tradition about tradition and a resistance to change, because that's the whole point about law, really. It's sort of objective and it's fixed, and so it requires a lot of thought to change and develop it. I think that was particularly strong in the Islamic world. There's a fairly strong sense that it was not for people to change and develop the world, or even to reinterpret. The idea that it had been fixed. But in practice, of course, the legal scholars, the muftis, the people who applied the law were developing and changing, certainly their legal practices all the time, to suit different contexts, different environments, and also in accordance with the different strands of Islam that were being followed. And that's one of the real problems and the tragedies, I suppose, about Islamic law in the contemporary world. It's become a sort of symbol of resistance to states, to the West, and then an appeal to fundamentalism, going back to the beginning. And so those elements have sort of been highlighted and coloured the way we think about it in a way which is extremely unhelpful.
Yeah, well, you see these Gallup poll surveys of Muslim countries, and what percentage of the citizens think Sharia law should trump the secular law of their particular state that they live in. And it's, that's worrying to a lot of Westerners that they think, whoa, well, so, whatever you think God's telling you to do is going to take precedent over what the government is doing or says you should do. And that, that could then lead to things like terrorist attacks and so on. God told me to do it, so I did it.
Well, that's yes, it's sorry, I'm just struggling a bit to work out exactly what to say in response to that. So almost every Muslim majority country now claims that it's based its laws on Islamic law, on the Sharia. And to some extent, even though everywhere except Saudi Arabia and possibly Somalia has got a sort of Western style legal system with a sort of a legal code, they claim that their laws are based on the Sharia, on the Islamic law. But still, there's the legal experts have got an authority which remains beyond the authority of the state, as it always has in the Islamic world. But it doesn't mean that people can just say, "I can do is what because it's what God told me to do." And a lot of the terrorist groups, they're using the idea of Islamic law to justify what they want to do. I mean, the vast majority of the Muslims are sort of horrified about what Daesh, the Islamic State, was doing and the terrorist attacks and that sort of thing. So it's using the name of Sharia and Islamic law in a way that it was never intended.
Yeah, that may answer the next question of what motivates terrorists, Islamic terrorists. Is it their religion? Would they do this if they weren't so religious? Or is it more political and then the religion is backed into it as a kind of a post hoc rationalization?
Well, I suspect in the vast majority of the cases it's exactly the latter. Yeah. I mean, I think there is, for a lot of Muslims, there is a sense that they are not understood, that their countries, their cultures, their traditions, their history have rather been ignored, looked down on by the promoters of Western civilization. And that has a lot of historical truth, of course, if you look at sort of Western um, activities over the last couple of hundred years in the Middle East. And it wasn't so long ago that the Islamic empires basically ruled most of the world. So if you only have to go back to sort of 17th century. So I think there is a probably at least partly justified sense of resentment. But the problem is that it could then become easily polarized into the West and the West and East, or the Euro-American civilization against the Islamic, and then can all too easily be used to justify those sorts of terrible organizations and terror attacks.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about slavery because one thing atheists like to do to throw in the face of religious people is, your people endorsed slavery until it was finally abolished in the 19th century. So for thousands of years, your holy book said it's perfectly okay to enslave other people. But then, Christians or theologians come back and go, no, 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 this wasn't slavery like you're thinking of Gone with the Wind in 19th century antebellum South. This is something different. They're more like indentured servants, and there were lots and lots of rules and laws about how they should be treated and what happens to their families and on and on and on. How do you think about that?
Well, slavery is such an interesting phenomenon, and I just wrote a piece about that, quite separately from this book. Um, yes, they're right that North Atlantic slavery was a particularly extreme version, where not only were people taken away from their original environments, transported thousands of miles in terrible conditions, but they were then kept apart, separate. And that's the most sort of extreme form of slavery pretty well ever to have existed. But historically, slavery has been around for hundreds and thousands of years. In more or less extreme forms. And there were two basic ways in which people became slaves. One was through war capture. And that happened. I mean, that was pretty terrible. Cities were burnt down, populations were enslaved, and they were taken out of their environments and then became utterly dependent on the people in whose cities they now lived. But generally, they weren't kept apart in the way that the African slaves were kept apart in the plantations. Generally, there were routes out of slavery, possibilities of buying their freedom, sometimes even marriage. So Hammurabi deals with this in his laws from Babylon in 1700 BC. He talks about what were effectively concubines and how their children became free. And those are patterns you see again and again and again. And then the other form of slavery, which was very common everywhere, was debt bondage. That's also pretty bad when systems of money are introduced and systems of debt and credit. And before you have laws of bankruptcy, some people can just sink hopelessly into debt and then effectively have to become slaves in order to work to pay off their debts. But that's a rather different form of slavery. And again, that's what a lot of the early laws deal with, including the laws of Exodus. I mean, the first laws in Exodus about how do you treat your slaves, but they're almost certainly referring to people in debt bondage. And what they're doing is they're ensuring that those people have routes out of their condition, that there are limits on how long they've been kept in debt bondage. I mean, it looks pretty bad to us now when we read them, but really what the lawmakers are trying to do is sort of regularize what was just a widespread practice. So those two forms of slavery recur almost throughout the world whenever societies get centralized, hierarchical, like that. And I think the North Atlantic slavery was really just the sort of, in some ways, the worst and most dramatic example that we've seen. So, of course, no one wants to condone slavery. Of course, both Islamic and Christian thinkers from the Middle Ages onwards had problems with slavery. It wasn't entirely abolished in either of those parts of the world, but there were rules that were in both areas which sort of restricted and ameliorated slavery to some extent.
Yes, well, because of the BLM movement here in the United States, there's been much hand-wringing over the founding fathers, many of whom owned slaves. And, they created this incredible document, all men are created equal, so on and so forth. It's like apparently some are more equal than others. And yet, can we really judge them by our standards in the 21st century? Maybe not. On the other hand, if you have to lock somebody up and use chains and whips, at some level, you have to know they don't want this. This is wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. But you're right. It's very difficult to judge now. And even if we say, yes, of course, we shouldn't apply our standards now, that, as you say, there are certain practices which seem just so abhorrent. Whenever you read about slavery, wherever it is, it just seems dreadful.
And same thing with colonialism. I think that in their minds, say British colonialists thought they were bringing civilization and a better life to the people they were colonizing. Of course, in 21st century standards, this just sounds like a ridiculous rationalization for stealing people's stuff and taking advantage of them and so on. But how do you think about it legally in their own minds when they were doing that?
Well, colonialism is a very interesting example because both North American settler colonialism, when the Europeans first came over to North America in the 17th, 18th centuries, both that form of colonialism and also European colonialism in India and Africa started off, and this is a big generalization, people started off with a lot more respect for the indigenous populations. And a lot more of a sense of trying to understand their ways of life, their relationship with their land, entering into treaties, rather than grabbing and taking hold and taking over. But in all those cases, as the colonial movement continued, it's sort of the attitudes hardened, and somehow they developed a sense of entitlement. Well, the Indians aren't properly using their land. Locke's told us that we need to, as John Locke, the philosopher, has told us we need to put value into the land through our labour and by agriculture. So if they're not farming the land, they're not really entitled to it. And those sorts of attitudes in Africa as well, and in India too. The sense of, well, there was obviously a much more sophisticated civilization, sophisticated in terms of huge populations, and the Mughal Empire and so on. And there the attitude was, oh well, it's Oriental despotism. It's all become degenerate, and they really don't know how to rule themselves anymore. And we need to come in and show them what proper democracy and technological advancements are. So it was a sort of developing sense of superiority, and ultimately law was a central part of it. We Europeans need to give our laws to them. Just ignoring all the centuries of extremely sophisticated Hindu and Islamic laws that had existed.
Right, and then that's where you get someone like Gandhi that says, all right, we're just going to not obey the laws, but peacefully.
Exactly. Yeah. It was getting at the British where that it really hurt.
Yeah, he was a lawyer, so he understood that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I loved your chapter on stateless law, tribes, villages, networks, and gangs. I was thinking of The Godfather and the whole mafia, which we're all familiar with now because of the movies. But then I was thinking about, I don't know if you know Pete Leeson's book, The Invisible Hook. Pete Leeson's an economist. So he did this study on pirates. And, we think of pirates as these kind of lawless scofflaws that are, just in utter chaos, psychopaths just raiding people. But he shows that, in fact, they were pretty orderly and that they had their own constitutions. Each ship had like a contract and everybody on the ship had to sign it. These are the rules and so on. And he even had this really interesting little analysis of the Jolly Roger flag, the skull and crossbones. Why would you fly that flag so that the other ship can see you're coming? And his analysis is it's a signal, like, we are badass pirates and we're coming to take your stuff. So you should just give it to us because then we won't kill you. And in a way, it's kind of a rational choice argument in economics. Like, I can get your stuff without the violence. That's better for me. I can turn a bigger profit if I don't have to spend a lot of lives to get it. And it's better for the people that are being raided because then they don't lose their lives and so on. And but occasionally you have to actually be a badass and do some really nasty stuff, but make sure you get a lot of publicity about it so everybody knows if you see this flag, we are bad people and we're coming to get you. So just give us your stuff. But he says it's pretty orderly.
Well, I don't know what he's exactly what he's talking about. Do you mind if I just blow my nose?
Oh, no, please. Yeah. And while you're doing that, I was just thinking about, again, The Godfather and the whole stuff about the mafia and the omerta rule. And, it was kind of its own rules and their own forms of punishment. If, you don't obey the laws, it's your casuistry argument, if then. And it doesn't have to be written down because, everybody knows through the oral tradition, I guess, these are the consequences if you break the omerta rule or whatever. And it's like that scene in The Godfather where Don Corleone has gotten all the heads of the families together after his son has been killed and the other guy's son was killed in the war and so on. And then he says his real motive is he wants to bring his son, Michael Corleone, back from Italy and he doesn't want anything to befall him. And he has this great line about, if you get struck by lightning or run over by a car, I'm going to take you people personally responsible here in this room. That's kind of an organized legal system in a way.
Yeah, but it's only kind of organized. That's the point. He's sort of making up his own rules. He's being the boss. He's throwing his power around. He's telling them what he wants. And I think that's the point about the mafia, that, yes, the rule of omerta, the rule of silence, and there were, as far as we understand, rules about how to treat each other's wives. But of course, they weren't written down. And they denied for such a long time to the outside world whether there was any organisation at all. This is the Sicilian mafia particularly, let alone they had these rules and these sort of structures of committees and councils. And that had two consequences. First, it was sort of protection from the outside. If you deny you've got an organisation, you deny you've got rules, it's very difficult to be criticised. But secondly, it means that somebody really powerful comes along, like Don Corleone or what was it? Sorry, I've forgotten his name. One of the big bosses in Sicily. If they can acquire enough power, they can ignore the rules. And if they're not written down, it's much more difficult for people to hold them to account. They can just break the rules if this is what I want. This is what you've got to do. I'm just to ignore the fact that you're complaining that, my son has run off with your wife or whatever it is. So that comes back to that difference again between the sort of the norms that people can manipulate because they're not written down, and the rules that people have to follow. They're explicit. They're out there. And yes, it's keeping things secret is really an excuse for manipulation.
You're right. That line, that implicit knowledge line where, you've got a nice business here. It would be a shame if something happened to it. And then, everybody
exactly.
knows
That's
what
not
that means.
That's not quoting any laws, is that? That's just saying, I'm the powerful guy here. You've got to do what I want you to do.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing that bothered me about the Godfather films, I liked it. I liked the films very much, but Don Corleone comes off as like the good guy because there was a protection racket, but he was the good protection racket guy because he was slightly more honorable. Honor among thieves. He was slightly more honorable than the other mafiosos. But
indeed,
still, in the larger picture,
the films have been criticised for that, haven't they? Or slightly glorifying the mafia. But I don't know. I've just watched them the other day actually by chance, and they don't hold back on some of the horrific things that they're doing, they're perpetrating.
Yeah, there's even been some studies of how the mafia itself changed from that movie. That a lot of them liked the movie because it kind of glorified them, and they thought, "Oh, this is cool. We have good, cool cars, and we dress up nice, and and we have all these, kind of almost like a James Bond kind of lifestyle." And it's really not like that. So let's transition from there to kind of wrapping up and talking about international law. You talked about the Nazis. I know a lot about this because I remember when I was writing my book about the Holocaust deniers, and I ran into David Irving, whom I know you know, and he had this in 1977. He published a book on Hitler's War, and this is where he hatched the idea that Hitler didn't really know about the Holocaust, and it was really done by Goebbels and Himmler and some of the underlings. And then he kind of transitioned to, maybe he had something to do with it, maybe not, but I'll give anybody $1,000 that can produce the order where Hitler says, I, Adolf Hitler, hereby order the extermination of the European Jewry. And of course, there's no such order. And the more I thought about it, it was more like at some point when you're doing extra legal things or beyond the law, and you kind of know it, you don't put it in writing. And then I tracked down a memo that Himmler issued when they were euthanizing German citizens. These are mostly mentally retarded and handicapped people, and work shy, as they called it. And at some point, there was a lot of bad press. I think the Catholic press was kind of looking into this and publishing about it. And then Himmler said, "All right, don't ever write about this anymore. We're not going to put this in writing. It's just this kind of thing we do." And you can go online and Google Himmler's Poznan speech, Poznan, Poznan, Poland, where he gave a speech to his underlings. And in there, he says something like, what I'm saying here shall never be written down. This is just between us. But this goes back to the July 30th, the Night of the Long Knives in 1933, where we cleaned house and we got rid of people. And we all know what it's like to see 100 dead bodies or 1,000 dead bodies. And it's hard at first, but I need you to kind of buck up. And all of this was supposed to be top secret. And so I can see how you can shift from a legal system, because you talk about how the German jurists tried to justify the things they were doing. But at some point, you can't, there's no laws about, okay, we're going to kill all the Jews. We can't put that in writing.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, Nazi Germany is a very sort of complex case legally, which I'm in no way an expert on. But you can see at least three sort of legal domains there. One is, as I describe a bit in the book, they were concerned about what they were doing in terms of international law and how they were prosecuting their warfare, especially in the Soviet Union. So they were at least making a show of abiding by international laws of war. Then in a more sort of operational level, as I understand it, they created hundreds of thousands of laws to hold their whole, to hold Germany together, hold the war effort together, to administer, to control what was happening. So they used law in an instrumental way. But you're absolutely right that if they felt morally uncomfortable with what they were doing, obvious thing was to not write it down, and then it couldn't be seen, it wasn't visible, and they would be much more difficult to hold to account.
Right, and at the Nuremberg Trials, Goering's defense was, well, we lost, but if we'd won, this would have all been legal, and so it's not really fair you have this trial because international. There was no international law, so it was like in the law of nations, we were doing what we do. That's none of your business. This is, I forget what that was called. After World War I, there was like a self-determination. Nations should have the right to determine what they do, and it's nobody else's business what they do in their borders. Of course, the Nazi borders expanded into Poland and other areas where they did do these extra legal things, but.
Yeah, I mean, it was the Nuremberg trials, legally speaking, were hugely problematic. And so innovatory in terms of the court assuming the power to sit in judgment on what the leaders of an independent nation state were doing largely within their own borders. But it was sort of hugely revolutionary in developing sort of genocide, crimes against humanity, the power and reach of international laws, this sort of humanitarian focus. So, yes, it was innovative. It was legally a bit difficult to justify, but I don't think anyone involved felt that there was anything other than a right answer that they were trying to achieve.
But also establishing legal precedent that going forward, any dictator who does something like this, if he's captured, we're going to hold him accountable, like Slobodan Milosevic is an example.
Exactly, and that ultimately led to the movement which set up the International Criminal Court, and the prosecution of, yes, particularly Milosevic in Yugoslavia, but other leaders as well. Although that itself is it's extremely difficult to bring people like that to trial. So ultimately, it can't be much more than symbolic. To come back to something we were talking about earlier on when we were talking about murder. I mean, really, is that going to stop anyone from committing mass atrocities, that they are likely to be held to account in front of the International Criminal Court. I very much doubt it. But it's a way of sort of symbolizing to the world that, these are the sort of ultimate crimes. Genocide, must be called out, people must be held to account. It sort of symbolizes in a way that sort of the wider moral world that we want to live in, and the standards that our nations ought to maintain.
Do you know this book, The Internationalists, How a Radical Plan to Outlaw War Remade the World? Ona Hathaway and Scott Shapiro. They talk about I knew nothing about this, that war was outlawed in 1928 at the Kellogg-Briand Pact in Paris, following the First World War, and what a catastrophe that was. And they make the point that, because the people respond to that, go, yeah, that worked really well. World War II followed after the war was outlawed, big help. But they make the point that just because there's still homicides doesn't mean we should abandon the laws that prohibit homicide. You still need the laws.
Exactly. And why human rights? Human rights are so important. It seems so essential to have statements about fundamental rights. And, if we try to do some accounting exercise about the extent to which human rights have actually helped or prevented atrocities or enabled people to get their rights or to safeguard their homelands or whatever it is, I suspect they would fare pretty badly. One of my colleagues did a study on torture, or the law of torture in the UK. And so, Britain, like being a good nation, duly enacted a law against torture to comply with its human rights, but it's very, very, very rarely been applied because it's so general. There's you bring someone to court and accuse them of torture. Well, then you have to define what torture means. Is what they did bad enough actually to count as torture? And it's actually, the prosecutors find it much easier to prosecute for people for much better defined crimes, where they've got all sorts of available remedies, and so they go for that rather than the law of torture. And yet, it's important that we have a international law against torture, because it's one of the most heinous crimes, and we're marking it out as such. So that's what it's one of the puzzles. Why do people put so much effort into making more and more laws when it seems that the bad guys out there just continue to ignore them? They continue to act in autocratic ways, and yet, but it's at least sort of making a statement about how the world ought to be.
Yes, well, after Abu Ghraib, of course, it all came out here that the shining city on the hill, were practicing not torture, but enhanced interrogation. When you look at what they were doing, it's torture by anybody's definition. Yes, and there's been calls for, people that don't like George W. Bush, that he was a war criminal and he should be tried in The Hague like Slobodan Milosevic was tried. And that's never going to happen, right? So to a certain extent, it depends on who's doing the accusing and to what extent you can do anything about it. It's so anyway. Well, I was going to say something else about torture. Oh, well, so again, outlawing it at least gives you some legal basis to prosecute it where you can, even if you can't always do that. Okay,
exactly.
I have one last. Yeah, go ahead, please.
So I was just going to say, at least it gives a language, to accuse people of committing torture, as happened in Abu Ghraib. It makes it sound much more serious, and it gives it that sense of something truly illegal. So at least it gives sort of rhetorical value to the language of condemnation, even if it can't actually prevent the act in the first place.
I know I was going to ask you about rights. Do you think there's a way to justify rights other than by fiat. It was it Jeremy Bentham said rights are just delusions on stilts or something like that. They don't really exist. If you don't have a government with guns that says these are the rights and we're going to protect them, you don't really have rights in any cosmic sense. And yet sometimes I think, well, but people are fighting for rights. Gays want to get married. They want to have the same rights to marry as everybody else. Why? Well, because there's some human nature built into us that we want freedom and autonomy and choice like everybody else wants that. So therefore you could ground a right to marriage in human nature. This is what people want. Extra, aside from what the government says.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of power in those sorts of arguments, and when we're talking about the sort of these big sort of issues of rights and moral values, surely it's bigger than the state. And hence the whole idea of human rights. They're out there, they're above any state. But interestingly, the idea of rights is very particular to the Euro-American world. That's how we've come to think about how society ought to be organised in terms of rights, and it suits us pretty well. Almost anything can be expressed in terms of rights. But other people didn't do that. Other people were much more concentrated on duty. So I'm talking about China and India, the Islamic world, certainly where I work in Tibet, just don't talk in terms of rights. And yet they worry about how they treat each other, how they ought to be treated, matters of morality and fairness and what we might call justice. They just use a different language, different way of thinking about it. I'd say the language of duty is pretty universal, but the language of right is something which is quite particular to the West. So that's not saying it's not important and we shouldn't continue to use it, but it's something which is, or maybe you could say by the same token, that it expresses something bigger or deeper than anything that any state laws can grant us.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that I asked Elon Musk on Twitter, and he actually responded. I said, when you start the first Mars colony, what documents would you recommend using to establish a governing system? The U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Humanist Manifesto, Atlas Shrugged, or Against the State and Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto? I was just kind of being cheeky there with him, but he responded. Direct democracy by the people. Laws must be short, as there is trickery in length. Automatic expiration of rules to prevent death by bureaucracy. Any rule can be removed by 40% of the people to overcome inertia. Freedom. Okay, so that's kind of a funny...
What a great specific
tweet.
Response. Yeah, he's thought about this.
He has thought about it, yeah. And at this South by Southwest conference in Austin, someone asked him more about this, and he said about what kind of government he envisions for the first Mars colony. He said this: most likely, the form of government on Mars would be somewhat of a direct democracy where people vote directly on issues instead of going through representative government. When the United States was formed, representative government was the only thing that was logistically feasible. There was no way for people to communicate instantly. A lot of people didn't have access to mailboxes. Post office was primitive. A lot of people couldn't write, so you had to have some form of representative democracy or things just wouldn't work out at all. On Mars, everyone votes on every issue, and that's how it goes. There are a few things I'd recommend, which is keep laws short, long laws. That's like something suspicious going on if there's long laws. That's really funny. So what would you recommend that the first Mars colonists...
Lots of interesting ideas there. And I completely agree there's a lot to be said for direct democracy. The problem with direct democracy is if you have too many people, it becomes really cumbersome. How do you get everyone together in a sensible way? The Athenians and the Romans had these huge assemblies, but it did mean that everyone got together and there was a sense of equality among them, which I think is really valuable. Other thing I would do, I would also learn from Athens here. I'd rotate positions of power. It's a conversation I've been having with a great anthropological colleague of mine called Alpa Shah, and she did some work in India, and we compared notes. Her work with villages in India and my work with Tibetans in Ladakh. And we found that they had the same systems for rotating positions of power, so that everyone was the head man in turn, or every household provided the head man or head woman in turn. And you would have thought, but that's never going to work because they need to provide leadership. You're going to get some duds as well as some really good ones. Isn't it better to elect the person who's going to do a good job? But actually, we both found that there were really effective ways of stopping certain people concentrating power. Of course, it's fine to have the good ones in power, but then the problem is that the rest of the people in the good one's family or their descendants or their wider relations get in on the act, and all of a sudden there's an elite family or a hierarchy and a bureaucracy. Rotating power's got a lot to be said for it. That's what I would do in terms of the the political system. Long laws, I'm not so sure I'm worried about them. As long as you get them written up, get them important ones out there for everybody to see so that everyone can read them and quote them, that's what's key. So, yes, not too many of them. Get the really essential ones up there. And then you need a good system of resolving disputes, a good system of justice. Needn't necessarily be a whole lot of laws being applied to resolve disputes, but some good system of mediation and conciliation with a few laws in the background.
Maybe you have rotating mediators so everybody gets a shot at being a mediator.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah, I like the rotating power. I mean, that was the whole point of the founding fathers here, that, as Madison wrote, ambition must be made to counter ambition, because we know what people are like, right? And so his first, it's like I've been reading the Federalist Papers, which are really quite revealing. This is my favorite one from Federalist Paper number 51, James Madison. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the second place, oblige it to control itself.
Checks and balances on the exercise of power, absolutely. So law is one of those. Law is one of the things which is used and should be used to hold the rulers to account. By itself, it can't do everything, but used properly, it's an absolutely key element in that exercise.
Okay. Well, I will send this to Elon, and maybe he'll hire you with his team of social engineers.
I'm not sure I want to go to Mars, but I'm happy to advise from the comfort of Oxford.
That's right. Yeah, I don't want to go there either. I'm told it's something like if you went to the top of Mount Everest, which people can't stay up there for more than like 10 minutes, it would be way worse than that. So you got to have space suits, and I don't know. Sounds like quite the challenge, but that's not our problem. All right, Fernanda, thank you so much for your time and for your great book. What's next on your research and writing plate?
It's been a real pleasure. I'm going to go back to Tibet, do a bit more exploration of Tibetan legal history. And I'm going to go back to the bar, even further back in my life, and look at what the barristers have been up to over history and how we can understand their rather unique profession.
Do they still wear those wigs?
They still wear those wigs. Do you want to see mine?
Yeah. Oh, my God.
Here it is. The one I used to wear up on my shelf.
Oh, my God. That's incredible. Now, there's tradition for you.
Exactly. Needs an anthropological eye, I think.
Yeah, right. Exactly. All right, Fernanda. Thank you.